Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, Joe Grabowski and I will discuss the second half of Chesterton's book, St. Francis. Stay tuned to hear about this exciting saint as told by our dear friend, G.K. Chesterton. Hello and welcome to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your co-host, and I'm joined with my co-host, Joe Grabowski. Joe, great to have you.
Hi, Grettelyn.
As I said before, we will be discussing the first book that Chesterton wrote after his conversion to the Catholic Church, the biography of St. Francis. If you've tuned in last week, you could hear the first half of the book that we discussed. If you didn't, you might want to stop and go back, but you don't have to. You can listen out of order if you want to. So we'll be starting from chapter 6 and going through the last 5 chapters of the book. Joe, do you want to kick us off with anything that struck you right off the bat?
Sure. I mean, my thoughts are kind of all over the place with this book, especially after our last discussion. You know, it's just so a general comment on the book for those who maybe didn't listen to the previous episode, or even those who did. It's just that it's a refreshing take on St. Francis. You know, it avoids sort of that kind of saccharine, sappy, hagiographical approach, and he will address that kind of late in the book, where he talks about a book about St. Francis could have been full of the legendary stories and the stories of miracles that just abounded in this man's life. But, you know, Chesterton wanted to present him as somebody relatable and real. And his great devotion to the saint and his great, personal connection to him just comes through on every page. And so it's a real treat. If you haven't read it, kind of strange that you're listening to this, so I do recommend that you go and pick it up. It's a quick read. You could read it in a couple of sittings fairly easily, and there's also, audio book versions out there, so there's really no reason not to read it, and you will, in doing so, grow closer to Chesterton and also to the great St. Francis.
Beautiful summary. Thank you, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with that, let's just dive right into chapter 6, The Little Poor Man.
Sure, I have a thought to jump off. Early into this book, he talks about a couple of things, but one is this real this theme that he's been building throughout the earlier part of the book, where he describes that St. Francis was not a lover of nature. He says, properly understood, a lover of nature was precisely what he was not. That phrase implies accepting the material universe as a vague environment, a sort of sentimental pantheism. But he says, nature, St. Francis, this is kind of related to Chesterton's idea of how you can't really love mankind, but you can love men. And in a similar way, you can't really love nature, but you can love a tree, and you can love a bird, and you can love the particular. And that's something beautiful in the witness of Francis that Chesterton draws out, is the way in which he approaches nature is always in that particular. But he also talks about how Francis's influence on other people was of like kind, in that they felt paid attention to, they felt seen in a way, especially the poor, the beggars, the lepers of the community. They always felt that they had Francis's kind of full attention and affection. And so, it's kind of a challenge, I think, to the modern age, because as Chesterton rightly diagnoses in this book and elsewhere, philanthropy, this idea of being a philanthropist, of loving humanity, loving mankind, it can be very easy for us, and in a way too easy, because you can donate through a charity to the poor, but that doesn't mean seeing the poor, it doesn't mean interacting with the poor, it doesn't mean embracing the poor. But what really are we called by the gospel to do? And so St. Francis challenges us in that way.
Beautiful. Yes. And I definitely got from this chapter that Francis had a real idea of what charity is. So, we know that charity is loving men, really, people, for the sake of God.
Hmm.
But it seems like he also loved nature kind of for the sake of God. And it gave him sort of a purity. My pop culture reference reminded me a little bit of the late great Mr. Rogers, who, if you know anything about him personally, and some of the older episodes literally had Bible quotes at the end of them.
Mm.
He was in a Protestant seminary for a while, um, and he definitely seemed to really care about people, but it was because of his faith. It wasn't some kind of secular philanthropy. But to an even greater extent, I think Chesterton draws that out, and we can see that in St. Francis in this chapter. He has that beautiful quote that I don't have in front of me, but you said about being seen, where he says, when he looked at you with those big brown eyes, and you were able to know that he appreciated you. And it was, it's a beautiful quote. I wish I'd written it down, but
Hmm.
yeah, it's a really good one. Yeah. Um, Also talks about the purity of Francis's poetry, which definitely want to touch on. We touched on this a little bit last time, but he says that Francis's ignorance kind of saved him from the pollution of the Greek myths and the Roman myths in his poetry. Not that we wouldn't want, say, Dante to have read. Well, I think he says that we would want Dante to know Virgil, but it gives a special purity that Francis did not. He sort of just was able to appreciate things as God made them, which is really beautiful.
Yeah, and that connects to an idea that comes up later in the book where Chesterton talks about Francis as being kind of the only true Franciscan. That he is such a special and unique person. This isn't to say that the people that followed him didn't to varying degrees and don't today really embrace and live up to his ideal, but he was just so uniquely um, graced to be able to be that radical witness in such a pure way. And it was this confluence of things, uh, even apart from the grace of God. It was precisely things like his lack of learning, because you kind of see in the way Chesterton describes what happens to the order later and some of the controversies, that some of the second generation maybe were just a little too clever for their own good in a
Mm.
way. And Francis, I when I read these passages of Chesterton talking about Francis and his relative ignorance, it always reminds me of when Philip, I think it's Philip, brings Nathaniel or Bartholomew to Christ, and Christ says, "I saw you under the fig tree," and he says, "Here is a true Israelite without guile, a
Mm.
guileless man," and he praises that quality. And Francis was definitely guileless, right? He
Mm-hmm.
he just didn't have,
No duplicity.
indeed,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's beautiful. And it kind of reminded me of there's a quote from St. Faustina's diary where she says, why did you choose me? And Jesus is like, oh, because you're just so worthless. But explained a little further, it's it's the quality that Christ kind of picks the people who couldn't have done this on their own merit, right? So
yeah.
it's this it's just has to be obvious that it's grace, that it's him doing these things through this person. Really beautiful.
Yeah, and it's this very sweet telling of a life that he almost makes it a little comical, that. And whether or not Francis intended to be the fool for Christ, he is, and he is in more ways than one. Not only does he sort of have that foolishness in the eyes of the world for being seemingly improvident in many ways. Like he describes, I don't know what chapter it's in, but it's in one of these chapters that we read this time. He describes the legendary meeting between Francis and Dominic, and how Dominic was sort of shocked that, like, you didn't plan for meals, and then all of a sudden, unlooked for, people just start bringing food. The
Mm-hmm.
wealthy of the town come out fate these wonderful Franciscans and Saint Dominic, and that's kind of how Francis lived. So he was foolish in that way, but he was also foolish in the Chesterton describes this, that he kind of thirsted for or desired martyrdom. He recognized that the suffering of Christ was something that he could never live up to, and some of his early followers did achieve martyrdom in Spain. It's talked about, but Francis, even goes so far as to go to the Sultan, and Chesterton just so marvelously describes that scene of this brown-habited weirdo in the Sultan's palace, surrounded by Ottoman Turks with scimitars, and you would think like the most likely outcome here is going to be a martyrdom, but instead he said something like Saint Francis, he was too loved as a man, and so the man was received even when the message was not.
Yeah, I like that line.
And that's a really, really fascinating kind of take on humiliation and gaining in humility, to in a way have your own winsomeness and personal guilelessness frustrate your attempts in a way to spread the gospel.
One wonders if Francis had had more time, if he would have been successful, if he'd been allowed to sort of stay in the court and keep working on him. Because as we know, evangelization doesn't really work unless you kind of come in and become friends with the person first. And he seems to have achieved that very quickly. But yeah, it's
and it is one of those great what ifs of history, because Chesterton says that some rumors floated around that there might have been kind of this interior softening or personal conversion, almost the diminishing of the hardness of heart, like of Pharaoh, in this case of the Sultan. And it reminds me of a similar story from similar period of time, which was the story's told of Marco Polo encountering Kublai Khan, and Kublai Khan supposedly being so fascinated and by Marco Polo's Christian witness that some sources allege that he too kind of privately converted to Christianity. Now, whether or not that was true, and certainly doesn't seem that either of them were baptized, the Sultan or Kublai Khan, but yeah,
only God knows.
Yeah, the great what ifs of history. If Marco had had a little more time, if Francis had had a little more time, imagine how different the world would have been, if the Sultan of Byzantium was converted to Christianity.
Yeah, it's a very interesting what if.
Yeah.
So yeah, love to touch on these amazing moments. Yeah, and then any last thoughts about this chapter 6 here before we move on?
No, yeah, I'm ready to move on. I think
we covered a lot of goodness there. Yeah, so here we're getting into Francis's defense of his poverty in chapter 7. And what he had to do to convince people that it was a good thing. Yeah, I one of the quotes that jumped out at me the most was talking about when they went begging, and it says he only sent the extraordinary men to encourage the ordinary men to be ordinary. So he wasn't asking everybody to follow this extreme poverty. He was just trying to get people to focus on the right things, and by his witness he was sort of doing this.
Yeah, and that Chesterton talks about the third order and how it comes, well, the three orders really, and so there's St. Clare, and the movement of nuns that grows out of this, but also of kind of the way in which the laity get to participate, and that is sort of a perennial problem in the church, even down until the modern age, right? It's one of the things that Vatican II tries to address, the universal call to holiness. Because, and Chesterton will mention this later, right, that marriage, the vocation, the state of marriage, the Fraticelli end up in their extremism coming to even condemn that of a state of life. But that's that's also kind of nothing new. There are earlier kind of indications of that in medieval Christianity, and you definitely see this in the East, like the state of life of the monk and in its perfection, say in like Orthodoxy. That's with a capital O and not the title of Chesterton's book. I'm referring to Eastern Christianity.
Hmm.
You you see this exaltation of the evangelical councils, which is good, but you see it taken sort of to an extreme where it becomes a disparagement of other calls of
Hmm.
other ways of life, and particularly of the married state. And there's sort of this kind of almost quasi-Manichaean strain that keeps cropping up and sort of tempting even people in the church to say that sort of like marriage is I think Augustine says it's a cure for concupiscence, right? But
Hmm.
if you take that idea too far, you
It's
can
very limiting. Yeah.
exactly, you can see why it becomes a problem. So, um, how did I get there? Oh, so this is all just to say that Francis has a value and has a witness that all of us can kind of be called to in various ways, and it really is that radical detachment and radical sense of dependency on the grace of God, which we should try to make an internal movement toward, even if we maybe don't have the radical mortification and the radical poverty uh, exteriorly or in our habit, or perhaps not in our state of life, right?
Hmm.
Maybe we're called to a vocation more akin to Thomas More, where we're going to have a great house and keep a great house, but we need to keep that house open to the poor and keep our own habits as simple as possible, um,
Hmm.
given what we have as a vocation to do.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why so many of us wish for Chesterton's canonization, and some of us even want his wife as well to be raised up with him, because they're such a beautiful example of marriage, and of a marriage lived out in really wonderful faithfulness to God and to each other. Um, but it's hard to canonize people who are married, because there's such a privacy, and single people too, because there's such a privacy about that kind of life. It's a lot easier to see, oh, this priest was very holy, oh, this monk was very holy. A little harder to get there with the sort of more private vocations, even though I can attest that marriage and children are a daily martyrdom in the best way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and in a way, like this is always a balancing act, I think, in the church, and certainly, like I said, Vatican II very strongly emphasized this universal call to holiness, but then the sort of, and I don't think this is any way causal or related. I don't think that the theology that Vatican II presented on that matter precipitated this, but I think the modern world that Vatican II was maybe a little late, if anything, trying to grapple with,
Mm.
did precipitate what we've seen in the decades since, which is a huge, huge fall off in these other kinds of vocations. So,
Mm. Mm.
and yes, we need marriage, we need secular vocations to be transformed into holier and better catechized states of life in general. That's still is the case, but he I think Chesterton, in an almost prophetic way, kind of sees that, because he comments upon, in this chapter, the three orders. He comments on how the modern novel would love Saint Clare, the figure of Saint Clare, if she eloped from her parents to go get married, or
Mm.
to marry some Don Juan. It would celebrate that. But feminism looks at what she actually eloped for, because she does elope. And not even just feminism, actually, probably some Christians kind of look at that and say, oh, that's being disobedient to her parents. She
Mm.
shouldn't have run away to the convent. Um, but Chesterton kind of puts that all in perspective and says, you obey God first, even above. And once again, without figures like St. Clare, there's so many, and this will lead us, I think, into the next chapter. There's so many passages of the gospel that can't make sense, like when Christ says, hate father and mother,
Mm.
and brother and sister for my sake.
He who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not worthy of me. And yeah.
Indeed, yeah. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're obviously not literally supposed to hate our our parents, right? Because that would also, Christ is not encouraging us to break the commandment to filial piety, but he is challenging us that there is this radical witness that even leaving your family for his sake in some cases, that's again one of these evangelical counsels. So
And if you can count the number of saints, particularly women from the very beginning who had to disobey to just be Christian, I mean, almost a lot of the early Roman saints, Saint Cecilia, Saint
yeah,
Barbara. I mean, they were all. Some of them were killed by their parents, so like they literally had to choose God. And Saint Clare did it too, and it's a beautiful witness that, and kind of a grand irony for the feminists
yeah,
that she has had so much more fruit in what she chose to do than if she had just gone off and married some Don Juan, like you said.
that's right. And another great example is another great Chestertonian, Sigrid Undset, very very wonderfully tells the story of Catherine of Siena and
Mm,
how just furious her family was that she decided that she made this private vow to virginity.
mm.
And part of the issue with her was that she didn't tell them why she was being obstinate. She didn't tell them she made this vow. She was just like, "No, I'm not getting married." And they were like, "Why are you so stubborn?" They didn't know that she had privately consecrated herself as a virgin to God. So,
Mm,
but I think that idea of the the model of the saints nicely leads us into this next chapter, chapter 8, the mirror of Christ, which I don't know, for my part, I find this just the finest chapter of the book. I
it's
I love
beautiful.
this chapter. So again, to our viewers, listeners, if you haven't read it and can't find time to read it, at least read this chapter. Um, yeah, what are your thoughts coming out of
Um,
that?
yeah, just a lot of beautiful things. Very very intriguing how he talks about a religious order versus a sect. And the idea that that Francis, even though his personality was so big, didn't just go off and start his own religion. He could have, but he did not, because he was too focused on being like Christ. Such a beautiful insight. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, and Chesterton builds this great um, he takes from the tradition, right? This what's often been said of Mary, for example, this comparison to the moon versus the sun. So he's talking about a mirror of Christ, how Francis mirrors Christ, and I forget the exact quotation, but he kind of presents it in a provocative and paradoxical way. He says,
Surprise,
yes, you can
surprise.
say, yeah, you can say that Francis is like Christ,
Mhm.
but in a way, you could even more truly say that Christ is like Francis. And again, like to us, it's like, oh, that sounds almost blasphemous. But his point is that Francis gives us a relatability again of that, those radical words of the gospel of what it means when Christ tells the rich young man to go away and give all he has, and give it to the poor. You know, the rich young man goes away sad, but Francis is like he was a rich young man, and he listened to that counsel.
Mm.
Um, but it kind of, even though we're as removed from we're almost as removed in time from Francis as Francis was from Christ and the first Christians. Still, Francis is that much closer and relatable to us.
Mm.
Um, so Chesterton says these, radical things that are described, we kind of can't picture them because they just don't mean. The example he uses, I think, is if when Christ says, if your brother presses you into giving you him your cloak, give him your shirt also, or your tunic also. And he said we could imagine one of these followers of Francis like getting robbed by somebody who like steals their cloak and then running after them to give them his shirt as well,
Right.
right? Because
Yeah.
that's the way they were living, and so it just puts flesh on the bones there, in such a lovely way, and it's
Yeah.
it's a great apology, or apologetic, I should say, for the cult of the saints. This is why, I think any Christian tradition that does not have veneration of the saints or admiration and communion with the saints is sort of impoverished thereby, because we lose these relatable mirrors of Christ, other witnesses of what Christ can mean in our contemporary age.
Yeah, and Chesterton points this out in other works as well, that this sort of extremism of the saints, but it can be extreme in like all directions. I think in I'm not going to get this right, but it might be Everlasting Man, that he talks about Saint Joan being very sort of militant, and then Saint Francis being very peaceful, and all these different sorts of saints that are privileged to have,
Hmm.
because the church can encompass them all. It's very beautiful.
Yeah,
But
and we need them all. We
mm-hmm,
need the Francises, but as you said, we also need the Dantes, and
mm-hmm.
we don't want Francis to have read Virgil, but we do certainly, because the Divine Comedy would be very strange without Virgil, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Virgil's the guide, so yeah.
Yeah, and just that whole you know, Francis is like Christ, Christ is like Francis. Uh, we just, as we're recording this, we just celebrated the Feast of the Ascension, and the gospel was, Philip, if you've seen, I think it was the gospel, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me.
Hmm.
And it's this whole idea that, Christ is like the Father is like Christ. And then you can get saints who kind of mirror Christ, and they're like Christ and Christ is like them. It makes sense. It doesn't, I don't know. It mind bends a little bit, but I think logically it makes sense. And that's what all the saints are striving for. That's why they're saints, to be like Christ. So not surprising that Francis was able to do that in a very radical and practical way. Go and literally just do things that Christ said, which I think most of us would look at, and it would blow our mind to even think about. So,
Well, this is sort of where he Chesterton talks or wraps up almost that theme of basically why. um I mean, he goes into it in the next chapter about miracles, a little bit, but he has a few paragraphs where you kind of expect, oh, now he's going to get into telling all the miracle stories, right?
mm-hmm.
But he never does. Instead, what he does is like he introduces it that way to set up that expectation, but then what he ends up doing is sort of offering this reflection on miracles, and putting them in their proper place and proportion.
Right.
Um, and again, it's very shrewd, because, you know, what is the purpose of God singling out these remarkably holy people in the church? Uh, it's so that they can imitate Christ, in order that we may imitate them, right? Like
Mm,
Saint Paul, writing to the Corinthians, right? I think it's 1 Corinthians 11, where he says, be imitators of me as I imitate Christ, right? And Francis is the same thing. He's an imitator of Christ, but he's someone we can imitate, because
right.
Christ is sort of, he's that bright sun that we can't even stare at too long or we go blind, but he's like the moon reflecting that glory. Um and too much of this is where the excesses of kind of some forms of piety, like the wonder worker models of saints, that when all you focus on is the remarkable miracle working and holiness, that distances you from that saint in a problematic way, in the
Mm,
same way that we're trying to mediate through the saint, right? Like it becomes that they become almost as unattainable as Christ, because, oh, I don't have miracles, I don't do miracles, I don't have a stigmata. And so I think Chesterton is very shrewd to kind of just leave that stuff out of it and just tell this very personable story. And he said, like,
mm,
because the point of the miracles is to captivate you and draw you in. But then if miracles are what the person is all about, I mean, then they might as well just be like a magician or a showman. They're
Well,
not
yeah,
teaching us anything.
Yeah, Christ rebuked, the people who came back wanting more food after he fed the 5,000. He's
Yeah.
like, you're just here because I fed you. That's not enough. But yeah, it's a similar idea. And I think that I don't know, in my own life, I know there are saints I relate to and there are kind of saints I admire. And it's funny because the ones I admire without being able to relate to as much, it's often because I feel distanced by their miracles more than their extraordinary holiness. Like, I really think St. Padre Pio is really neat, but I cannot relate to him in the same way that I can relate to even like Teresa of Avila, So like it's
Hmm.
just this sort of back and forth of, or St. Francis. Because of this book, I can really relate to St. Francis. Yeah, but it's very shrewd that he goes about it that way, um, and sort of points out in a subtle way the miraculous quality that St. Francis had to just live this way. It was almost more miraculous than any miracle that he did, is that he was able to give his life to this and then stick to it and draw other people to it, in such a radical way, literally living out the gospel in his everyday life is the most amazing miracle yet. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that miracle working, wonder working side of things, that you know it distracts us from what we are called to imitate, which is just as challenging and just as sort of seemingly far out of reach, right? So we can't necessarily like will um, to be like Padre Pio, to be able to read souls, or to have the stigmata, or to bilocate, or to levitate, or any of the other glorious things. And I don't think we should like seek after that. But when Francis, embraces the leper, or embraces the beggar, that love for the poor, that is something that we can attain.
For
Like I
sure.
said, seemingly though equally out of reach, and I think that there's a reason for those kind of parallel things, that just as much as the one obviously requires grace and the movement of the Holy Spirit in the action, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't walk on water without God's help.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obvious. We forget that these other movements of the Spirit, caring for the poor, the outcast, the needy, that are just as challenging. Well, of course they're challenging because they require grace. They require the movement of the Holy Spirit just
Right.
as much as those other deeds do.
Right. And it's funny because thinking about it now, I saw a little clip of Padre Pio once because he was modern enough. There was some video,
Hmm.
uh, and it's like probably the most relatable moment I've ever felt to him. He sits down at table, and all the monks around him are eating their spaghetti, and he has one crust of bread. I was like, that's something I can imitate.
Yeah.
I can fast. So like yeah, it's kind of this special, like you said, it takes grace, but there are definitely like more attainable steps, and Francis has so many of them, just in his everyday life. It's beautiful. Well, let's go ahead on to the miracle section. We're kind of touching on that anyway. Um, I love that the second to last chapter is miracles and death, and you're like, okay, it's over, right? And then there's another chapter, but we'll get to that. Um, yeah. So he goes into this long thing about science and miracles and what people would believe in and what they won't believe in, without really saying the word scientism. Uh, he describes scientism, because scientism, essentially rejects evidence if it doesn't agree with scientism, which is unscientific. Uh,
Hmm.
so he goes into that. There's even, I remember that I heard about one scientist who was going on his way to try to disprove the Shroud of Turin. And on the way, he was being interviewed, and he was like, I really don't care what the evidence is. I'm going to reject it if it doesn't fit my theory. All right, great.
Yeah.
um, yeah, but Chesterton just very clearly calls out this sort of uh, fallacy that this is not scientific at all.
Yeah, it's a great as I said, apologetic for uh, miracles. And I think kind of, you can sort of see. I don't know whether this particular work, but certainly the idea is almost they do remind me of some of the moves that Lewis later makes in his book Miracles,
Mm.
C.S. Lewis. Um, Although I find this particular work one by Chesterton that Lewis would have been least likely to have read. I know
Mm.
that he read The Everlasting Man, but I don't know whether he would have read this. But in any case, Chesterton, I think, not only defends miracles in this, but also, again, sort of anticipates what would come about in particularly scripture scholarship, right?
Mm.
Because what he describes about medieval lives of the saints here and the way historians want to pick and choose, I mean, that really describes what was it called? The Jesus Seminar, right? The movement of, well, there's the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, right?
Mm. Yes.
Trying to separate these two things and
Yes.
pull it apart. And he just calls out the fundamental fallacy involved in that sort of reasoning. If the witness is credible, if the testimony is credible, then your only consistent way of approaching that is to take it all of a piece.
Right.
You can't say like, well, let's take who was it? Jefferson, right? Jefferson kind of rewrote the New Testament and took all the miracles out,
Right.
took all the divine
Yes.
stuff out. Well,
Sanitized it.
yeah, you can't do that.
Right.
That's a fallacy because the same people. It's at least more. I still meet people, even though historians overwhelmingly agree that a man named Jesus of Nazareth lived and was crucified under the Roman rule in Palestine. Um, but at least that's a mentally consistent point of view to reject the Gospels and their testimony wholesale.
Mm-hmm.
What's unintelligible, as Chesterton points out, is to try to say, yeah, I can believe the whole life, death, and crucifixion thing, but the resurrection is off the table. It's like,
Right.
well, what source do you have for all the other stuff other
Right.
than the same people who said, by the way, I saw this other thing?
Right.
The
Either the
most,
gospel writers are giving us evidence or they're just liars, as Chesterton says about St. Bonaventure. Either he's
yep,
telling the truth about St. Francis or it's just a big lie.
yep,
That's it. There's kind of no in between. So, and as we know, Chesterton likes to find the middle road. So if he says there's no middle road, he's probably right. Um, but yeah, it's kind of amazing. It really gives you a new appreciation for a purity of mind. The single mindedness, the virtue of single mindedness, to be able to see things as a whole and not hold contradictory statements as true in your mind. Um, yeah.
yep. So, yeah, the last we've already really because we're jumping around a bit. I think we've covered what he talks about at the end of that chapter, miracles and death. So the whole first part is this sort of apologia on miracles, and then the latter part is sort of about how Francis kind of did get his martyrdom in a way, in that he um this lover of he wasn't a lover of nature, but this lover of created things,
Mm.
um and of the creator in his act of creation, goes blind, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in his
Yeah.
blindness, plus the stigmata, right? So this sort of, he definitely had a interior unity with the crucifixion, even though he never achieved his goal of actually getting martyred.
Mm. Yeah. And his final wish to die on the floor, I think, is just one of those
Hmm.
beautiful things. Uh, yeah. If Christ couldn't die in a bed, neither should I. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, again, like I said, I got to the end of this chapter and I was like, okay, that's the end. And then no, there's one more chapter, which we could talk about right now.
Hmm.
Um, so let's dive into the Fraticelli and some of the sort of Franciscan heresies that happened.
Yeah. So I mean, it's basically a kind of rigorism, right? Which, you know, if our listeners haven't, go back and listen to the previous episode, right? Because Chesterton this chapter, if you forget where you came from in the book, it seems to be just, Chesterton kind of cleaning up an issue that if you're writing about St. Francis, you have to deal with this, right? But there's actually a through line all the way from early in the book where Chesterton describes the world St. Francis found, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this this rigorism of some of Francis's followers, the ones that they end up saying, not only will they not have personal property, but they won't even have custody of things. They won't even own in common or take care of a church, right? And then, like I said, they go on to disparage marriage, which is a sacrament, and they have various other kinds of rigorism. But that was almost inevitable. That arising at this time, because Chesterton identifies early in the book that Francis is coming at this moment where paganism, nature worship, had been defeated, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the whole methodology by which the church had gotten there was this sort of radical retreat from the world, from you know the Benedictine renewal in the
Mm-hmm.
church. And so, there's going to be that pull back, and not only do you see it there, but you see it moving forward in history, like with the Cathars in France, right? And or you know Cathars, Albigensians, whatever you want to refer to that whole period as. Um, so
Yeah, rejection of the body.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then it comes up later with Jansenism, and
Comes up again and again. There's
yeah,
actually a sect that a Christian sect that came to Harmony, Pennsylvania, which is near where I live, and they rejected marriage. Didn't work very well. Took about one generation, and people were like, "We're done."
yep,
Um, but yeah, it was sort of it's just it kind of comes up again and again. This idea that it's you're like you said, it's a rigorism, it's a scrupulosity, it's tending too much towards one thing, which Chesterton defines heresy as is the exclusion of truth or of all truth, because you're too focused on one aspect of truth, and it becomes untrue, becomes heresy at that point.
yeah, and you know, uh, he once more reminds us that the church, as the body of Christ, has its different members and its different
Mm,
parts, and the left hand and the right hand may work in concert, but they do different functions. And so he refers to the Pope, who is not as holy. I think he calls him a smaller man than Francis.
mm,
But that doesn't mean that in some ways he wasn't right, whereas Francis was naive,
mm.
precisely in his lack of learning, his sort of his own ability for radicality. Uh, he says like Saint Dominic was like a military. He started this thing and it was going to run and it was going to go. Whereas, of course, Francis, if you just think about what he's all about, he's not an administrator. He's starting this thing, and
Nope.
of course, it's going to fall apart within a generation
Yeah.
because he's not taking stock for where tomorrow's breakfast is coming from,
Mm-hmm.
for himself, let alone what his order is going to be like in 100 years, in a century. Very Chestertonian in that way, right? Like the way that Chesterton would sell his writings was
Mm.
very similar, not taking too much stock of the future.
Yeah, very willy nilly.
Yeah. So we need both those kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, Chesterton needed the other Frances, Frances, right? She was sort of that more grounded, earthly. I
How
don't
do we
want to
keep a
say
house over our
worldly,
head?
but yeah, yeah. Martha Mary. It's
Mm-hmm.
just again and again these currents in history. Just such a wonderful insight that reading the life of a great saint gives us into how the church is always and everywhere the same, you know?
Mm-hmm. And Chesterton understood that so well, and I think he recognized the narrowness in these heretical religions out there. That you sort of had to be one way in all of them. You just had to be like this, or you had to be like that. But in Catholicism, there's so many ways you can be holy. You can come at it from all angles, and there's really a saint for everybody, which is really special too. So it's obviously, it seems like St. Francis was at least one of his saints. And you can really see why in so many beautiful ways. Yeah, so from his artistic nature to, like you said, his sort of willy-nilly caution to the wind, God will provide sort of mentality. Um, it's amazing how he recognizes this for himself, and he helpfully points it out to so many of us following in his footsteps.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, talked about this book for quite a while. If you have any other thoughts, Joe, before we wrap it up here.
Well, I guess last thought, not so much about the book, but if you read the book, if you fall in love with it, if you want to learn more about it, come to the 42nd Annual Chesterton Conference. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of this work in Minneapolis, July 27th to 29th. That's at chesterton.org/conference. And we'll have wonderful talks from Bishop Barron, Dale Ahlquist, Joe Pierce, Daniel Kerr, and so many others who will provide even more insight not only into this work, but into the lives of Francis and of Chesterton and the times in which they moved. It's such a rich experience of, edification and education, but also of fellowship. Please join us at the conference.
Yeah. A little spiritual boost too. It'll definitely. It's almost a
For sure.
retreat more than it's a conference. It's like a party / retreat. I don't know.
Yeah.
You should come. It's a great time. But yeah, and if you are coming, and if you're not coming, read this book. It's really, like Joe said, it's short, it's brief, but it's engaging. It'll suck you right in. You'll be able to get through it quickly. And it's beautiful. It's a really beautiful way to connect with a saint that really doesn't seem like he's 1,000 years old. I don't know. This book makes me feel like Francis could have lived at any period of time, including today. So, Thank you, G.K. Chesterton. And thank you, Joe, for talking with me about this. This was really fun.
Yeah, it was a great time. Thank you.
And once again, I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your co-host here on Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, make sure that you give us a good review, help us to reach more and more people, because we really want more friends, because we know Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you, and talk to you next time.